Hello. Okay. Thank you so much, Doctor. This is my first time listening to this kind of lecture, actually. What my first question was that you were saying that Islam is a new religion, right? It is very quite young to be compared with Christian or maybe Hindu. Is it in the future we might have a reform in Islam? But it comes back to your statement after that. It's very, you can't compare reforms, Islam's like Hindu and Buddhas and Christians, Judaism and Christians, because it's very different of the structures and everything, right? So maybe we could say in the future, do we call it reforms, or we would say it more like a rethinking of Islam? Especially when you were saying that scriptures of the Quran is by Allah and the interpretation is by human. And although you can say that the Quran is Arabic, but most of the people don't even know Arabic, and it depends on the translations, right? And most of translations are very quite different for the social dynamics on the translation itself. So what do we call it, like rethinking or maybe? Yeah.
It's very important to realize that according to Islam itself, according to Islam itself, Islam is not a young religion, right? It began with Adam. It's the primordial religion, Din al-Fitra. It's always been here. It's been corrupted by subsequent communities. The prophets gave perfect enunciations of the message, Moses, Jesus, then the people who followed them corrupted it. So I'm giving the point of view of an agnostic historian. When I debate things, I always do it from an agnostic point of view, meaning not as a committed believer. Of course, you're a Muslim audience, so I added in a lot of Islamic stuff. So Islam is a young religion from the secular agnostic point of view. It's not young from a theological point of view. According to Muslims, it's very old, right? Yeah.
How can you say Islam is old when like prayers, fasting, and wearing hijab is only after Muhammad, and before that there's no such thing as praying 500 years?
Yeah, well, yeah, I understand that question. I'm saying historians, to be factually correct, they say Mohammedan Islam, meaning the Islam established as an institution with Saum and fasting and so on by this man, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, the greatest reformer who ever lived, according to secular historians, by the way, not just Muslims, right? I mean, look at his achievements. The point is that in the Quran, because the Arabic language does not have capital and small case letters, the word Muslim can be understood to mean a capital Muslim with an M, like we are Muslims with a capital M. But the Quran says that Abraham was a Muslim, meaning with the small m. Anybody who surrenders his will to the will of God is a Muslim in that sense. So all the previous prophets were Muslims. Another act of dispossession, by the way, Jews and Christians are outraged by this. They're saying, I thought Jesus and Moses and these people were Jews or Christian. The Quran is saying they're already Muslim. Imagine if you're an evangelical and you don't understand the subtleties of the Arabic language. It sounds outrageous. Right? Now they're stealing our prophets, saying these are our prophets. In fact, I remember saying this to somebody, that the Quran claims that all these prophets were Muslim. And they said, oh, you mean David, Solomon? I said, well, they were kings, but we think of the prophets. They were all Muslim, he said. He looked a bit shocked. Because remember, he didn't distinguish between our sense of Muslim with a small m, linguistic sense of anybody who submits, from capital M, which means those who came in 7th century, formal Muslim, like you and I are, born into the religion of Islam. Our Shahada is a kalimatain, it's got 2 sections to it, one about God and the next bit about this man called Muhammad in 7th century Arabia. And he said, you see all these people, Abraham was a Muslim too? I said, yeah. My God, he was shocked. And then he looked a bit disturbed and he said, don't tell me Jesus was a Muslim. I said, I'm afraid I have no option but to tell you that. And he was very distressed because he couldn't understand. Now, your question about reform, is it a possibility or is it always going to be rethinking? Obviously, it depends on what you mean by reform. What I suspect will happen is that you can reform a religion while remaining faithful to its core principles. The real difficulty is if you reform a religion to a point where, in fact, it's not that religion anymore. So, for example, in my own writings, I believe that Reform Judaism, which is one of the 3 or 4 main sects within it, is actually a disguised form of atheism. Obviously, I don't say this to the rabbis if I go to their home because they think it's insulting, but that's why I've written. some of them know what I've written, and they'll quote that. They say, you said that, you didn't mean that, did you? I said, yeah, actually I did mean that. So the difficulty would be that if the reform was so revolutionary, they took away the core principles. In the case of Islam, the core principles are very few. You know, oneness of God, and the fact that the apostle brought a book, and that he was the last apostle. I think the emphasis on the finality of the Prophet has, of course, caused official expulsion of the Ahmadiyya. I don't know if you have Ahmadiyya people in this country, yeah? They're considered officially, you know, kafir, right? Because of the denial of the fact that the Prophet is the last Prophet. But I'm saying that the number of core beliefs in Islam are relatively small. You know, there's of course belief in the angels and so on. So it would be very difficult for someone to reform to Islam to such an extent they became unrecognizable. And the people said, this isn't Islam. I mean, there have been periodic movements to say fasting is bad for the economy. You know, people are lethargic and tired, so let's abolish fasting. And I think in Tunisia, this reform proposal was made. But they've always been shot down by more conservative elements. So the Islam has retained a relatively strong, robust core foundation. And then people have made cosmetic changes along the sides. So for example, as we were mentioning, you know, Dr. Taj was mentioning about modesty in clothing and hijab and so on. I mean, this will vary across the Muslim world. But obviously the core principle will be modesty, or, you know, a level of nudity, which in England, for example, we tolerate, which you do not in, you know, many other Far Eastern countries. Some level of it is tolerated, but not the extent that, you know, we do in France, let's say. So yeah, I think the principles would be the question. So if you start compromising on matters of taste and fashion, you're fine. But if you start compromising on a matter of principle, like for example, if you're bringing up children, what do you say to them about, say, homosexuality or alcohol consumption? If you think these are absolute wrongs rather than merely relative ones, then obviously you'll teach them to say, well, look, these are bad things for you, while fully knowing that perhaps they will go astray under the influence of society, but hopefully they'll come back to their Islamic origin after a period of having gone astray. So I think most people would say that some areas of sexual ethics, some dietary laws will remain difficult and resistant to change. Now, of course, in a sense, you can mine the tradition, mine meaning look for things, resources like Dr. Taj does so brilliantly. You can mine the tradition and say, look, there was probably greater variety of opinion about these matters than we now think. You know, we're being a bit too puritanical if we think all Muslims are like that. You know, there are people, for example, I think Hanafi jurists have got some rulings on alcohol consumption that are more liberal than, say, the Malikis. But the real question will be when you compromise on a matter that people say, no, this is an absolute principle, like the oneness of God or the finality of the Prophet. I think that's where people will say, that's not reform, that's actually changing it so that a rose by another name is still a rose. Effectively, you've left the faith. I mean, when in England, for example, we hear people on the TV news, and you know, people accuse each other of being not a true believer. One of the principles that is used, and which I actually think is a valid principle, is that if you are constantly defending the interests of non-Muslims, then no matter how pious you may be in your private life, most Muslims in the community will say, look, he's not on our side. Whose side is this guy on? Yeah? You know what I'm saying? I think people have this group loyalty, which has nothing to do with religion. All groups realize that. So for example, if you had a Chinese minister or an Indian minister who was constantly putting down his own community and, say, propping up or admiring Malay people, then his own community would say, well, you know, he's Chinese, he's Indian, but really, you know, he's pro-Malay to the extent that he might as be one of them. So when we ask of a group of people, we say, whose side is he on? Right? I think we're asking a political question about interest. And I think in that definition, certainly Muslims will say that if somebody reforms their commitment to Islam, they say they're a Muslim, but then everything they seem to be saying on TV and so on seems to be undermining Islam, then I think people will in effect treat you as an apostate. And that's a big change in the attitude of the community, where apostasy is no longer simply somebody coming along and declaring it, saying, I no longer believe. Like Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens wrote a book with the provocative title, God is Not Great. And the reason is because he said, I'm tired of hearing these Arab-looking people saying, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. I don't like it. God is not great. I'm great, he said about himself. Right? Which, of course, is the definition of blasphemy and shirk, right? I hope that answers your question.
For the very fascinating speech just now. I have one question and one sort of like a request.
Okay.
The first one, will you explain and draw the similarities or differences, if any, of the Henry VIII action that have led to the reform of the church in England to the same mosque in the Islamic world? Has there been any instances in the Islamic history of the internal rejection to the unfaithful actions of those who led Islam, that consequently leading to reform due to the corruption of the mosque or maybe the imams in the Islamic world? Secondly, will you maybe explain as to why did the Western philosophy depart from natural law, as was introduced by St. Augustine and also Thomas Aquinas, to more secular Jeremy Bentham? That's about it. Thank you.
The origins of the Anglican Church are in the 16th century English Reformation, if you like, part of which was ecclesiastical, people being burnt at the stake and executed, including in Oxford, by the way. We have a martyrs' square in Oxford, which commemorates the burning of Protestant heretics. Cambridge-educated men who were in Oxford and who were burnt at the stake for holding heretical opinions against the Catholic Church. Henry VIII, yes, he's the founder of the Anglican Communion. Although it's called Anglican, it's actually a Catholic fellowship, because you get Anglicans in New Zealand and Canada because of the British Empire. So Anglican actually is also a Catholic, meaning universal fellowship, although its name is misleading because it implies it's something to do with England. It's not actually. As a result of the empire, the Anglican Church is universal. You find it everywhere in the world. But its origins are English, and the word Rex Anglicana, the English king, if you like, goes back to the 13th century with the Magna Carta, which is the first document to mention such an institution, a church of the English people. But as a branch of Christianity that broke away from the official authority of the Pope, that's what you mean by under Henry VIII, right? When there was an oath of supremacy saying that the Henry VIII, who wanted a divorce and couldn't get it under Catholic law, simply decided to make his own church and give himself a divorce. So it's a very rather dishonorable origin for a religion, right? That somebody needed a divorce, basically. But subsequent to that, it developed a lot of interesting Protestant ideas that were very critical of the Catholic Church. So that you have a book of common prayer, for example, which differs in its liturgy from the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the Bible used in liturgical worship by the Roman Catholic Church. The Mass is said in Vulgate. Vulgate means armia, vulgar, meaning something for the mob. Not very sophisticated. Yeah? In modern terms, you asked about whether there'd been a similar attempt by a Muslim monarch. One of the caliphs, I think, 11th century, didn't he go insane? There was one caliph that went mad. Can't remember which one. It was an Egyptian. He was in Egypt. Remember, he tried to curtail the rights of the Ahl al-Kitab, and because that goes against the Quran, he was deposed. I don't know whether he was assassinated. His name will come to me, but he was one of the Abbasid caliphs, actually, in the 11th century, the Christian era, was deposed by Muslims. But normally, Muslims have this very bad habit that when they get into power, they're not reluctant to let go of it. And so the only way to get rid of them is through the additional inducement of assassination. That's a very it's deplorable. I mean, you see this with Bashar al-Assad and everybody. People are saying, we don't want you anymore. Look at England. I mean, not in the past, of course. English crowns, the executed monarchs were there. Monarchs were executed to remove them from power. But I think in the last, say, 100 years or 200 years, there's an admirable change of power, isn't there? I mean, remember David Cameron lost the referendum in Brexit. And what does he do? He comes home the next day to Parliament and says, I'm resigning. Then Mrs. Theresa May, who's equally incompetent, served office for 2 or 3 years, and she says, I can't do it. And then Boris Johnson, I mean, no assassinations, I'm saying. Imagine if Cameron had said, I'm not leaving, and the whole of the English people up in arms. I'm saying that, unfortunately, in the Islamic tradition, we do have this tendency that we don't have a recognized procedure for deposing caliphs. There's actually no recognized procedure for deposing of a pope either. Popes serve their office until death or infirmity, which means loss of mental capacity. But as far as I know, except in the medieval period, you wouldn't normally think of a pope, holding on to power to the point that, he would need to be removed by force. I was talking to Ihsan this morning at breakfast, and he was saying that, I hope you don't mind me quoting you on this, Ihsan, but he was saying that in some ways, the Malaysian official ulama system is very similar to the Anglican Church. No? So in the process of becoming like that. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, right. Sure. Right. Right. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I mean, the current functions of the Church of England are ceremonial. It is an Anglican bishop who must place the crown on the Queen's head, or Prince Charles if he were to become. So in that sense, it has power, but it's ceremonial power because the royal assent is given to laws made by Parliament. So it's a constitutional monarchy, which means it's not an absolute monarchy. The monarch cannot act outside the law. Admittedly, unlike the caliph, the monarch of these countries is not subject to her own jurisdiction. I mean, if I commit murder and then I'm taken to court, then it is Shabbir Akhtar versus Her Majesty. That's the official charge. You can't, if the Queen were to commit homicide, you can't have the Queen versus the Queen. Whereas in Islamic law, Sharia law, the caliph is actually a civilian subject of the state. He's not above it. He's subject to Sharia. So in principle, we do have that. But I'm saying in practice, it's very hard to depose of a caliph, meaning officially have a trial like the impeachment trial, the impeachment of a caliph.
Maybe,
and I'm sure some
sorry, if I may follow up, maybe not politically in that sense, but all I'm looking for is, say, for example, due to the corruption of an imam, in a particular context, in a particular year, a long time ago, that have led the Muslims at that point of time to say, okay, we're going to reject that, we're going to have something new, and we're going to abandon that old practices. Is there even any? Because that's what happened with the Henry VIII because of the divorce. They changed the marriage law in the England because of that.
Yes, that's true. Now, as far as I know, nothing quite like that has happened. I mean, we've had some, like Al-Mawardi's book, Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniya, the principles of government, which is a post facto justification of Abbasid caliphal authority. There have been apologists who've written on behalf of caliphs to defend them, but we don't have a procedure for accountability, if that's what you mean, and to the radical reform of matrimonial laws in the aftermath of a particular caliph's personal relationship problems, which is what was actually happening with Henry VIII. It was in a sense a trivial matter, and yet it became a theological matter. It was a domestic matter about a marriage. As far as I know, there's been no such equivalent. I mean, unless somebody else has heard of such an example. I mean, Islamic history is just as rich as Christian history. Sorry? I said that there may be such a case, but I'm not aware of it, and certainly nothing as influential as Henry VIII.
No, on the Thomas Aquinas and the...
Yeah, sorry, I forgot about that. This actually is a very insidious in a way of development, because if you say, and this has some basis in the New Testament, St. Thomas was canonized as a saint of the church. If you say that unaided human reason or universal human reason can come up with certain principles of morality which are reflective of human decency outside of revelation, that may well be true. But if you make the content of secular law independent of revelation, then ultimately such a liberty may eventually lead to the complete secularization of law. So for example, in the West, common law it has Christian elements in it inherited, but it's really a secular system. Whereas the Sharia by definition is a religious system. We have qiyas, analogy, and ijma, consensus, which are human products. But the point is that because of the Quran and the Sunnah, which is like an adjunct to it, being considered uniquely authoritative and divine, and in principle not subject to radical abrogation, Islam actually does not think that natural law is the right approach. Now, Aquinas, of course, didn't intend the natural law tradition to develop that way. Right? Remember that this is the danger with reform. You may take certain steps in good faith and try to preserve a tradition and to amplify it and modify it and enlighten people, but you do not know what are the unintentional consequences of the reforms you take. Meaning 50 years later, somebody may take those reforms as the basis of a very radical reform that effectively lands you in a secular direction. I mean, natural law begins as a kind of compromise on the question of the balance between divinely revealed law, what's called canon law in Catholic tradition, meaning which has some kind of relationship to the New Testament as interpreted by the historians of the church, and then completely independent secular development. After 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, which was an attempt to secure peace between the warring nations, Catholic and newly Protestant emerging nations, we've got the notion of a sovereign state. It goes back to an earlier peace that was declared in Augsburg, which is a German city, in 1555. All of this was an attempt to say that the secular realm of law and morality are essentially independent of their Christian parentage. Because all these laws were actually of Christian authorship. Remember, they came from the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, which is the Hebrew Bible. And then in the New Testament, Jesus repeats these and saying, this is the law. I've not come to change it, but to ratify it. So all of this had, if you like, a religious authorship and a religious parentage. And then the natural law tradition embryonically and perhaps unintentionally starts to take law in the direction of independent secular status. But that's not what its intention was, because that was a very, Aquinas' 13th century medieval world. His whole life was about the church and about the fact that there's a God. But if you look at the consequences of that step, it's a kind of caution, which is why I was saying that I'm not personally in favor of the view that Islamic reform should imitate the historic models of the Christian faith, because I think almost all of them have led to disaster, by which I mean that instead of confronting secular modernity, confronting it, they've accommodated themselves to it. And if you do enough accommodation, you allow the other person to dominate you. So, for example, the West is now still religious partly, but it's religious on entirely secular terms. Secular people decide how much religion is to be allowed. It's very difficult when there's a conflict between the church or between the religious private conscience of the individual and the state law. It's very difficult for someone in the religious sector to say, I have a right to overturn state law. That's actually what the Rushdie affair was about. A group of Muslims were saying that if the state law of Anglican England conflicts with our commitment to the honor and dignity of the Prophet, we will fight for it through civil disobedience. But the example is that the conflict only arose because there is that dichotomy. And Islam, the Sharia, is an amalgam. It contains both relatively secular matters of etiquette, like, returning the salam to someone is a part of the Sharia, but it's obviously not a criminal offense to ignore someone, not to return it. But I'm saying it's a matter of etiquette, just good manners, protocol. And yet at the other end of the Sharia, you have something as serious as being stoned to death for adultery. There's a big range there. And not all of it is natural. I mean, the idea that certain offenses should be punished in a certain way is not necessarily easy to argue for them on natural lines. Muslims would say this hudud, and it's been revealed to us. No such comparison in Christianity, I'm afraid.
2 points. I think you rightly pointed out on facile comparisons.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very important to bear in mind.
Yeah.
My question would be, what then will be the criteria of a valid comparison methodologically?
Right.
How can we even do comparisons and under what circumstances? Because we do know, for example, that in this world, no two things are equally identical.
Absolutely true.
But there must be some basis for comparison. So what would be that valid criteria? And if we were to look at the Islamic tradition itself, we see a lot of hybridity as well as synthesis, as what we have heard from Dr. Tajul yesterday. Right. And that also means that there has been ongoing comparisons going on that led to hybridity as well as comparisons. And I think those will be very important not to ignore. Yeah. Otherwise, it becomes very puritanical and exclusivist. That's my first point or question. The second one pertains to what you mentioned about acceptance of reform within the community. And I would like to highlight, for example, Jesus, which you did mention. Jesus was a reformer of Judaism, but there was also a certain rejection of him on certain grounds, as him not being part of the community, especially the charges by the Jewish leaders. Like he broke the Sabbath, for example, by doing his miracles. He's wining and dining with people who are seen as not of the right category. So it brings to question about this politics of reform, actually. Because what we are seeing is not a discussion over the quality of the ideas, but rather a kind of ad hominem emphasis and questioning of anyone who brings about the agenda of reform. And this also leads to a certain confusion as well as politicizing of any kind of agenda of reform, because appearance can also be deceiving.
That's true.
We've seen, for example, self-professed reformers who adopt a certain mannerism, certain way of dressing and all that, but we know that the ideas are actually deformative as compared to someone who does not look like a mullah or a sheikh, and yet is very grounded in the Islamic tradition in terms of his arguments, his or her arguments. So going past this politics of appearance and understanding that sometimes acceptance in the community takes time, as well as there are also power and competition at play, I think will give us a bit more ground in terms of assessing whether it's reformation or deformation.
Well, it's an excellent and very profound question, and very eloquently expressed. The key thing is that because some of these reforms are taking place in the aftermath of colonialism, if any stimulus is perceived to be Western, most Muslims instinctively reject it, even if its content is good. Let's say, for example, there's some agitation for reform of women's rights. Somebody were to say that, you know, in practice, no matter what the Sharia says, in practice, Muslim women suffer from a lot of loss of legitimate rights. And let's say the stimulus comes from the West. A Muslim woman goes and studies in Chicago or Harvard and comes back with some of these ideas. She's still committed to her faith. But people say, oh, so she's come under the Western influence. So there's a tendency to wholesale reject it. So this approach is a feature of, you know, reform movements, is that people often ask, reform in whose interests, you know, whose interest does it serve? So if the reform movements and their stimuli are internal, that question is not asked with the same urgency. For example, nobody says that the Christian Reformation was caused by the Ottomans. Well, maybe some people say that, agnostic historians. But I'm saying, generally speaking, the difference between European reforms and all other reforms, including Islamic ones, is that their reforms were internal. Right? People in England and France and possibly slightly, you know, broader part of Europe were agitating for reforms of the Catholic Church. It didn't come from a wholly different continent. Our problem is that in Islam, unfortunately, we find that we get foreign patronage of certain movements of reform, and that's the politics of reform. And I'm always suspicious if, let's say, some English missionary or American missionary is very keen on a certain type of reform. Because you have to ask yourself, is it entirely based upon principles of justice and equity, or is there some, you know, hidden corporate interest, or maybe, you know, the greater the amount of economic progress in a country, the more subject you will be to capitalist manipulation by powerful Western nations. That's the real difficulty, that because there's a total lack of parity of power, political power in the world, the reformation of Islam looks like an entirely political agenda. I mean, for most people in the West, Islam is actually not a religion, meaning it's not a source of morality and spirituality. It's just a nuisance which stands in the way of economic exploitation of oil. So, for example, you find policymakers in America, certainly, and maybe in England too, they think of entire parts of the Middle East simply as places where there's oil. It doesn't occur to them that people live there too, who may have certain moral aspirations, or who may think of their religion of Islam as a source of moral strength and not simply as an obstacle to Western policy. That's the reason why there's such a very tense politics surrounding reform. I personally think that most people who call themselves Muslim reformers, and this is a topic for another session on the progressive Islam, I think that they are unintentionally perhaps being manipulated by Western powers. So as long as your reform movements are autonomous and internal to your civilization, that's good. That does not mean to say that there's no external influence, but it means that the external influence is also filtered and channeled on your terms. Right, for example, I'm not wholly a product of Pakistan. Obviously, you know, for my education and so on, I'm Western, but, you know, I've got a balance. There are aspects of England and of the West I admire. I'm speaking their language, I wrote poetry in their language, etc., but there are aspects I don't admire. And I'm not going to seek a sycophantic assimilation to everything that Westerners believe in. You know, what was called garb zadagui in Farsi, the Westoxication of the world, where, you know, Iranian intellectuals would go to France to study, and then they would come back and try and impose a French model of secularism on Iran, for God's sake, you know, which was a fervent Shiite nation, essentially. So that's the big problem about credentials and criterion. To put it slightly more accessibly, I would say that subconsciously, and I'll comment on Jesus being a rabbi in a minute, subconsciously, I think that ordinary Muslims, meaning those who are innocent of philosophy and theology, simple mosque-going people, I think they always subliminally, whenever they see a name in print of a Muslim academic or thinker in Western academia, ask themselves, does this man or woman's writing ultimately empower our community and service interests, or is it a secret way of undermining it in some sense, emasculating it? Right? That's the litmus paper test. So they see somebody's name and they say, oh, this guy's a sellout. You know, he's always saying what the government wants him to say. He's not genuine. I'm talking about England, yeah, my experience of England. Or if they see a name like mine, they might say, well, he's a philosopher. Some of his ideas are funny, but I think his heart is in the right place. I think he's trying to serve his community. He cares about us. He wants to empower us. Now, the really shocking thing, though, is that you'd think that this litmus paper test is used by Muslims. It's actually used by the West as well, in reverse. Right? I'll give you an example. Somebody makes totally ludicrous claims about Islam without any knowledge of Islam. He suddenly becomes promoted to a professor at Harvard without any credentials. This has actually happened. I know of some people who've had that trajectory. And you say as an outsider to the authority, you say, how come you promoted this guy? Well, he's talking about reform, you know, increased freedom for women, he's against extremism. In other words, a very shallow agenda which simply serves their agenda, and the person is promoted. On the other hand, if they see a Muslim who's making a lot of sense and talks sensibly, talks about balance and justice and so on, but he's too much grounded in his own faith, right? I mean, ultimately he remains a part of his own religion. Organically he belongs. Even though he's very fair-minded, there's still a degree of hesitation, and the Western establishment will say, well, he's not one of us really. So you see how people are co-opted for political motives which override purely moral concerns or the degree of intellectual ability. So, you know, your request for credentials would be fair to ask in a perfect moral world, but our world isn't like that. People do look at whose side you're on, ultimately, no matter how clever you are, no matter how fair you are. Now, with regard to Jesus Christ and the picture of him in the New Testament Gospels, my commentary on this letter to the Galatians looks at this question in some depth. It's a very complicated question, but there seems to be an emphasis on the interiority of motive and the purity of the heart. You know, I mean, Jesus was a kind of Jewish Sufi, really, right? Wasn't he? Right? You know, talking about love and all that. Not a bad thing, but you know, you have to have love within certain limits, because it can become. Because the difficulty with love and with Sufism, and we'll go on to this in the next section, is of course they can deteriorate into something that is just too sentimental. It doesn't really guide your conduct anymore. It becomes something that satisfies you emotionally, but it's actually quite bankrupt.
Thank you, Dr. Shabbir, for an enlightening lecture. Actually, after your lecture now, I feel that I'm going through a paradigm shift. For instance, now I understand by your lecture is, yes, I understand that Islam is not Christianity. And that it is not even, it is not even the comparable, and they are not analogs. And of course, we cannot then produce Islamic Luther as a reformist. So it means the demand of Islamic Reformation seems to be somehow without basis now onward to me. And what I feel now is that only the problem areas of Islamic societies or the Muslim states, they need some kind of a socio-economic reforms more than the Islamic reforms. And only the area which I think is the counter-terrorism or extremism is the area, or bringing people together, or bringing the tolerance, more tolerance on the basis of Islamic tradition, is that what is required, not the Reformation. So that is my understanding of your lecture. if it is correct?
Progressive change, greater harmony, which is very, effective and actually is practiced in this part of the world. You don't need to make a conscious effort at it. It simply happens as the unintended result of economic forces. More of a Marxist analysis of what's happening. We're talking about self-conscious reform that is being proposed self-consciously by people who consider themselves believers in a particular tradition. The socio-economic forces of real politics, they do not actually take account of religion. Occasionally it happens, like in the case of Catholicism in Poland, it stands up to a certain Marxist view, or Islam in the case of Iran stood up to it. But I think that that kind of economic reform heading in the direction of progress and tolerance is actually inevitable in the modern world, with the result that, if you ask somebody what is the largest religion in the world, they would say Christianity, second largest Islam. When in fact the truthful answer is that the largest religion in the world is shopping and using your credit card. I mean, that's a completely global religion. Look at the amount of time and investment people have in technologies to do with buying and selling. I don't think that is going to be the result of active human thinking, meaning nobody's going to have a conference saying, let's move this society in this particular direction, and that will increase the tolerance in it as a result of economic activity. I think that's happening inevitably. Sometimes some people inside religion will stand up to put a halt to it, like in the case of Iran. The feeling was that the society was being too rapidly secularized and beginning to serve as an American puppet for American capitalism. I mean, you're right in understanding what I'm saying, but I'm also saying that agency in reform terms is where you make a conscious effort to change something. So you look at the state of the world, whereas a lot of what's happening around us is entirely beyond our control, and what we say here is irrelevant to it.
Shukriya, thank you, Shabbir bhai. Just a couple of points. One of the things that I really benefited from here, because being involved in these debates about why doesn't Muslims, why don't they produce their Martin Luther today and have the Reformation? So of course I can just debate that on starting from Martin Luther himself, but what I learned a lot from you today is going even back further and to speak about how it's so erroneous and fallacious to even try to make that comparison in terms of the origins of these different world religions as well. Because as you know, the competition, as you were saying, I mean, Irshad Manji's, but some slightly more sophisticated individuals like, of course, Abdul Karim Soroush has been the leading contender on the New York Times for the title of Martin Luther. I'm surprised you're not on that list yet, but I think that be careful with Muhammad probably eliminated you from the list of reformers. But anyways, just one of the things on the Reformation that I think that from Martin Luther's time is also one of the things at least I emphasize in my own course is also the political economy, which you touched upon as well. So beyond the kind of pure theological rebellion against the ecclesiastical Roman Catholic Church, also the political economy of the various principalities, the proto-nation states emerging within Europe itself. And I think that in some ways, within the Muslim world, I mean, we don't understand. We think it's just merely a theological issue that they had and this type of thing, when there were a lot of other factors involved in that particular historical moment. And of course, this applies to the entire way in which we think about these processes of secularization, secularism, the understanding that the West has of religion today, a post-Enlightenment, Northwestern European notion of religion that wants to be imposed on all of the rest of the world. So I think that it's those are important points to make, that these are totally kind of unrelated and you can't even compare. My question was, and actually the last point I really liked as well, when you spoke about all these religions, we talk about which is greater, and I used this essay by Harvey Cox and David Loy, The Market as God. the religion of the market ultimately is the greatest religion today, right now. I mean, people may want to call themselves Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists,
Right.
Christians, and so on. I really like that. But my question was, on this, the whole discourse around reform in Islam. Yesterday we heard a lot of interesting material from Dr. Taj, whether it's Islah or Tajdeed, and the whole notion of that every century will have its mujaddid and this type of thing. Maybe I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about what, how do you find that mujaddid? How do you who's that mujaddid, and what is that mujaddid required to do? Is it similar to the going back to the roots, the renewal, or maybe a little bit on that? Huh?
Yeah, there's a remark of the surrealist painter Salvador Dali in his book. His autobiography, by the way, is entitled Diary of a Genius. He's admiring himself. And he says there that do not try to be modern. You have no choice. Meaning everybody's modern, yeah? That's the point about capitalism being ubiquitous. You only have to travel in an airport to see everybody's on their phone, everybody's texting each other. That's the common culture now. Not much time for reflection. So modernity is inescapable. That was the reason why I said that the correct motto is to confront secular modernity and try to Islamicize it, rather than the Christian option, which was to accommodate it successively, beginning with the Reformation, through the Enlightenment, up to the death of God movement in the 20th century. So that religion really is no longer capable of offering a critical comment upon the society around it. Why? Because it has no gap, critical gap between itself and the society. You can only have such a gap if you have a moral accusation to make. That society is going the wrong direction. So, for example, we don't have a sufficiently robust anti-capitalist movement, which is one of the great failings of all religions, no matter how much they talk about. I mean, look at the Muslim, conservative Muslim world. For all their commitment to Islam, these are basically capitalist oligarchies at the behest of Western powers. That's all it really is, even though the people themselves may have what Marx called false consciousness. On the question of recognizing the new reformer and your semi-humorous point about why I wasn't included as a reformer, is that it depends in the Western mind. The reformer whom they select for Islam has to be somebody who basically serves their interests. They're not interested in a real reformer, and that's a difficult question to decide. Your point is absolutely right. If you completely hermetically seal yourselves off from all external influences, that's a kind of fanaticism too, because it implies that you've got nothing to learn from the human heritage. I actually, on the contrary, think that it's good to have ecumenical, eclectic mixing. The question is, where do you maintain your own core personality or religious values, and then use the other things, basically in some sense, to serve to enrich yourself? That was the difficulty. How do you recognize the true reformer? Well, it goes back to the litmus paper test. Does this person empower Islam in all aspects, or does he simply undermine Islam while pretending to be a Muslim and serving Washington? I think that's a very difficult question for policymakers to decide. They have to find the right person. I don't think it's a difficult question for ordinary lay Muslims. I think ordinary lay Muslims always know. And incidentally, the choice of the mujaddid is always posthumous, isn't it? During the lifetime of such a figure, he's persecuted normally. After he's died, posthumously there's regret, and you say, oh, he was a good man. He was the reformer, I think. So I think it's not something that you choose as a candidate the way you do for like a winner of the BAFTA award or a beauty contest, where the selections be made while the person's around. I think a lot of these judgments are made ex post facto, usually after the death of the alleged reformer. Does that answer your question, Junaid? Is there something else you wanted me to add further on it? Well, I mean, people like Iqbal is certainly cited as one, isn't he? Because he did live at a very difficult time, to be fair. And Jamal al-Din Afghani is cited as an example, although his case is more suspicious. His biography is more scandalous. You mentioned Tariq Ramadan, and again, he did important work on, despite the tragic circumstances surrounding him now, but he did important work on the notion of European Islam and how Muslims, I know you disagree with him, but how Muslims should see themselves as part of the European scene, and try to contribute to it and not always be in opposition to it. But there I think he's a bit naive because really the rejection is from the European side. I don't think Muslims are saying we don't want to assimilate on. I think the Europeans are saying assimilate wholly on our terms, otherwise you'll always be pariahs and outcasts. And that's where I think Islam has resisted modernity, secular modernity, much more robustly than other religions, which have fallen prostrate. I mean, Judaism, for example, has become completely assimilated to the point that American Judaism, in my view, having lived there, is just really a fundraising scheme for Israel. That's all they do. Right?
First, I would like to express my gratitude to Dr. Shabbir because he mentioned about what Hamid Dabashi said, the alien informer in brown skin white mask, where people like writing bad things about Islam, either they are Muslim or not, like to make money out of it. The first question is about, you mentioned about access to God. Can you elaborate more between what is viewed in Islam and what is viewed in Christianity? Because I don't think you elaborate it. I'm not sure whether you mean it like there's a mediator between the person and the God.
Sure. Good question. Thanks.
The second thing is, would you elaborate more on the Muslim tradition interaction with the text? For example, in the time of revelation, the Prophet mentioned to the Sahabat about doing zalim and sins, and the Sahabat was like sad because they say who did not do zulm, and the Prophet mentioned back in Sahih Bukhari, saying it's not that, but it's actually the one in the Surah Luqman, in a shirka la zulmun azim. The zulm is referring to shirk. It's not like the normal understanding of zalim. So I want to know a little bit more on the tradition from maybe Christianity of the interaction towards the text. Yep.
The notion of access to God is completely different and radical in Christianity. You have access to God through Jesus Christ and through the Trinitarian conception of monotheism, where God is a personality who relates internally to different persona. You know, a bit like a person saying of themselves, I'm a teacher, but I'm also somebody's son, I may be a father, I may be, different roles, right? So the intimacy of the divine life, if you like, is a very complex subject in Trinitarian theology, where you have God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And Christians feel that the Holy Spirit indwells the believer. Indwell means that this holy agency is inside you, right? So, for example, when you're praying to God through the mediation of Jesus Christ, you're being enabled by the Holy Spirit. This type of complex theology of prayer, for example, and access to God in petition and supplication is foreign to Islam, except in mystical Islam, which borders on heresy, like Ibn Arabi. Generally speaking, Sunni orthodoxy does not hold such opinions. I mean, the idea is that, the salat is the miraj, or the ascension of the believer, right? This is an individual experience where you ascend to God, if you like, yeah? Like the Prophet, literally went there, but we do it every time we pray to God sincerely. So there is direct access to God, and you can directly call upon God. The Quran says that all the beautiful names belong to God. Fad'u biha, and call him by those names. So ask him, say, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim, Ya Jabbar. So there's a direct access to the divine being. It doesn't require the mediation of Jesus Christ as an individual Savior, Messiah. The Prophet has no such role. As I say, in practical mystical piety and popular piety, people do assign the Prophet such a role. But in Islamic theology, strictly speaking, every human being in virtue being created has access to God, which is why Islam affirms the election of Israel, but does not affirm the election of Israel at the expense of the rest of the human race. Right? It says, yes, we did favor the Bani Israel, but if you favor someone, that doesn't mean that you neglect the other person's rights. It's like the Prophet, Yaqub in the Quran is, in a sense, guilty of favoring Yusuf, right, and neglecting the others. But as long as, same in polygamy, as long as formally you give the right amount of affection, legally required, if you like, to each wife, then the fact you, as the Prophet preferred Aisha, does not make you guilty. The point is that the election of Israel was an act of favoritism on God's part. But favoritism doesn't always have to be moral. It's immoral if you say to someone, I elect you for this preferential love, and I reject the other person. Whereas having the right to be guided by God and to be forgiven by God for our sins, except for shirk, is a divine birthright. It's a human birthright of all of Bani Adam, not the exclusive birthright of the Bani Israel. That's the misunderstanding that the Quran corrects on, in particularly Surah Baqarah and Al Imran to the Jews, that yes, you were favored, but not at the expense of the Gentiles. That's something you made up, the second part. That's racism, essentially. And it's a libel against God, because you're saying God himself has said so in the Torah. He hasn't said that. That's something that you invented. That's the accusation of tahrif and changing it.
There's a part of the interaction between Christianity and the text.
In the textual tradition, both of our religions have produced extensive commentary. I mean, the commentary on the Quran is nowhere near, in terms of voluminous length, that is, as the commentary in the New Testament. But that's because the New Testament is actually, like the Christian religion itself, in my view, not an autonomous revelation. The New Testament is actually a commentary in the Old Testament. So it's already linked in that way. This is why when you make a commentary on the entire Bible, the vast plane that you have means that you can write a much bigger commentary. The Quran is a much shorter scripture. It's only roughly 80% the size of the New Testament and only a fifth of the size of the entire Bible. And I'm talking about the Protestant Bible, which is shorter, as you know, than the Catholic one. Okay, so extensive textual interaction, I'd say, in both religions, but much more in Christianity. It's an older religion, which is an amalgam of two religions, basically, Judaism and Christianity.
All right, thank you, Dr. Shabbir, for your presentation. But when you mentioned Irshad Manji, I think it's quite funny because basically in the, if we use Islamic tradition based, then Irshad Manji has no merit. So, I mean, for us, we see Irshad Manji is the one, I mean, is nobody. So therefore, even though she is, I mean, a calling for reform and whatnot, if the basis is, I mean, not ground on the Islamic intellectual tradition, then it's automatically rejected. No. But with the idea of that you take Irshad Manji seriously and you see that Islam somehow is under attack by the West, manifested by Irshad Manji, who is a Muslim and I mean influenced by the Western agenda and whatnot. Actually, this is the problem because with this kind of idea, Muslims in the majority Muslims country, problem is they are facing the oppression from the government and religious authority, as you say, that which side of which side that you are on. So, as for our example here, IRF and Sisters in Islam are not on the side of government. So, because of even though we are bringing the discourse based on Islamic intellectual tradition, valid one, but we are easily demonized because they see us as the part of Western agenda to westernize the Muslim community in Malaysia. And not just that, to the fact that Sisters in Islam has been fatwa deviant by the Selangor Religious Authority, and we're still fighting at court to make sure that the fatwa is not imposed on us. So, I mean, with this kind of idea, if you see that conservative Islam is all okay and progressive Islam is actually infiltrated by Western agenda, this is very, very, I mean, very problematic because any attempt that, any attempt of reform done internally in the Muslim majority country with the basis of Islamic intellectual tradition is easily demonized. As I mean, it happens all the time. And as for example, in Egypt, where Ali Abdul Razik, when he wrote the Al-Islam wa Usul al-Ahkam, he was expelled from the Al-Azhar. So if you bring this kind of idea where progressive Islam always with this Western agenda infiltrated, so like, I mean, where is this going to?
First, I appreciate number one your starting point on creating the differences in understanding the religion of Christianity and Islam, because that is important towards the later part. Moving towards the in order to understand reform in comparison between Islam and Christianity, it relates to the Christians' experience of reform tends to focus on the ecclesiastical elements. Martin Luther's confrontations with the Catholic Church mainly, which is not similar with the point on Islam. And this is a point which I think I'm a bit more fortunate, as I've read partially of your book from Islam and the Political Religion, is the relation between the idea of religion and the practicality of the religion. Meaning to say that in your book is part of the argument as the construction of Christianity from its earlier start about the nature of revelations, the construction, it doesn't have the strong elements of the political aspect. While at the starting point of Islam, from the most basic, the Quranic process itself is a continuous revelation over 23 years, which involves political elements with direct relations to the actual life of the Prophet and the communities at that time. And later the conception of the Sunnah by itself. Meaning to say that the discussion about reform in Islam is never separated with politics. Meaning, in other words, reform is always part of that continuous process of Islam creating Muslims, and in some ways Muslims influencing the interpretation or the construction of the idea of what Islam is in itself.
Right. Start with Huda's question, which is about a certain degree of subliminal anxiety that people feel when they're being accused of others. I do not, by the way, dismiss all progressive Islamic movements as being conspiratorial movements with co-conspirators from the West. I think there's some clear examples of it, though, paradigm examples, but there are also very clear examples of people who are doing serious work to tackle problems internal to our tradition, about rights issues, about shallow kind of militancy that may lead to us losing even more lives at the hands of American drones. Instead of having a proper strategic response, just some young man goes and kills innocent people. We all recognize that that kind of violence is not going to actually change the balance of power. It might even make the enemies more resolved to eliminate Islam through targeting and assassinations and so on. So I don't actually think that there's a dilemma. I think you have to ask yourself personally this question too. Whose interests are you serving? Are you trying to empower, not you as a group, but any group that stands for reform should be sincere with itself and say, are we trying to do this analysis and deep thinking ultimately to increase and promote justice, not only for our own community, but for the human community, which, as you know, the Quran is a universal revelation. It's aimed at every person of goodwill and conscience. So it's not a fanatical, ethnically restricted religion. In fact, that was the Quranic accusation against Judaism. That it was, you have made it your own personal good fortune. We favored you, but it doesn't mean that we've neglected the rest of our creation. What an insulting view of God that is, to think that God is the racist too, that he only chooses one community. Why should he do that? So I think that, I'd like to reassure you that, I am myself very concerned with reform, and a lot of philosophical thinking I do, and the puzzles I've indicated about what troubles me, those puzzles only exist because I'm trying to solve the problem and to serve the intellectual cause of Islam. They wouldn't arise if I thought Islam was untrue, or if I thought, which is in my view, the Western view of Islam. I think the Western view of Islam is the very problematic one. The Western view of Islam is that Islam is a false religion with a dangerous political potential. You can write that down. That's all it's about, really. There's nothing else. The rest is nuance. It's a false religion, meaning spiritually, morally, it's got nothing to sustain people. Something with which we disagree strongly, because we know it sustains our lives. We feel nurtured by it. I mean, when I have personal problems, I may increase my level of spirituality. A lot of my colleagues will probably decide, unless they're Christians, maybe drink more or do drugs, some way of coping with life's problems. So the fact that Islam gives sustenance to us religiously and morally is of no concern to Western policymakers. Not to ordinary Westerners, some of whom may be motivated to find out about Islam and may even be very impressed by it and may sometimes think that we may not convert, but we're allies of it. My difficulty is that the policymakers' view of Islam is that there's no recognition of its moral and spiritual aspect. It's too clouded by the judgment about economic interests. So Islam is just a hindrance. You know, if it weren't for these Muslims, the West could have access to so many more natural resources. It's just a big inconvenience that a lot of this stuff is under the soil of the Arabs. You know, if only it was located in Belgium or something, or a fellow in a Christian Western power, or maybe in Australia, which is an extension of the US in the Far East. That, I think, is the real problem that makes people suspicious of progressive reform movements, because they look at the larger context of power. Nobody ignores that, by the way. No matter how intellectually pure you may imagine yourselves to be, and I certainly regard myself as intellectually pure, meaning I do philosophy, so I'm not trying to influence the world. But other people don't judge it like that. If you write a book on Islam, even on Islamic philosophy, it will have political consequences. There's no such thing as neutral authorship on an Islamic subject. No matter how neutral you may think it is, other people will read significant political alliances in it, which is one of the reasons why in all my recent works, I never write an acknowledgements page where I talk about who to thank, because people can read into that who your patrons are. So if, for example, your list of people you're thanking is mainly Jews and Christians in a book on a New Testament commentary, then Muslims would say, well, we know where he gets his ideas from. Look at all his friends. They're all Zionists or they're all Jews. And I think people make those assessments no matter how objective you may be trying to be as a scholar, which I certainly try to be. Now, with regard to your point, Ihsan, I certainly agree with you that the bulk of the Christian reforms were ecclesiastical, because there was such a strong ecclesiastical power. In fact, the motto of Catholicism was extra ecclesiam nulla salus, which in Latin means outside the church, no salvation. Right? So that's a very important principle. Remember, the Protestants denied that principle in being a splinter group, saying, well, you know, we are outside the church and we claim salvation. In fact, we think you may not get the salvation, right? Because you have compromised Christ by having too much of these ecclesiastical powers given to the Pope. Remember, the Pope is rejected by the Protestant church. They're saying that he's not the true vicar of Christ. Vicar means representative. Vicar roughly means khalifa, actually. You know, vicar means, like the word vicarious in English comes from the Latin word vicar, in place of someone, yeah? So someone who's representing something, the best qualities of it. So was there another part to what you were asking me about, the political consequences? Yes, Islam is a political religion. I mean, I called my book that, right? Yeah. With Christianity, absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, Jesus was not a general. He didn't lead any armies. He was crucified according to Christians. Well, even according to Muslims, there was an attempt to crucify, even if it didn't succeed. The point is, he wasn't a leader like Napoleon Bonaparte or like our prophet. He wasn't a statesman. He had, if you like, well, I would say he had abandoned, according to the Christian account, I'd say he had abandoned the political sphere, but Christians would say no. Actually, it looks like an abandonment or abdication of social responsibility, but the right attitude towards politics is to renounce it, because it is essentially satanic. There's a passage in all the three synoptic gospels where Jesus is approached by the devil, and the devil says to him, tempts him with three things, and one of them is, he says to Jesus, look at the kingdoms of the world, I shall give all of these to you if you serve me. Right? And while, of course, Jesus rejects that offer, right? He says to the devil that, you know, basically the implication is that nothing from the hand of the devil is good. Even if it's intrinsically good, since it's being given by the devil, that contaminates the offer. Right? You know what I mean? Even if the devil offers you something virtuous, the point is he's the one offering you. You should be suspicious. You say, why is the devil offering me this? So Jesus rejects these three temptations. Whereas in our faith, the idea is that the political realm is sanctified by religion. You have an ethical politics. The Prophet was an ethical statesman. In other words, he didn't go for, you know, gratuitous violence. Look at the amount of violence that Islam actually had as a revolutionary religion. Absolute minimum. Compare the revolutions of the rest of the world. Look at how many people were guillotined in the French Revolution. You know, the revolution of Mecca, the conquest of Mecca, how many people were killed? An absolute minimum. And the rest were pardoned. And of course, as you know, the rest of the story was a spectacular success for Islam after Al-Hudaybiyah, which looked like a humiliating capitulation, but actually it was, in fact, it led to a great success.